The state, Bastiat wrote, is that great fiction by which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else. While it can be debated what Bastiat meant, there is a great fiction which currently works to undermine all labor and all the accumulated wealth of every American, and by extension, virtually every laboring individual on this planet. We all work for this fiction every day. People beg for this fiction. Many borrow from others to obtain this fiction. Some even kill so that they can unlawfully accumulate more of this fiction. Without this fiction, you could have no clothing for your back, no roof over your head, and no food for your stomach. That great fiction is the American dollar. You can pull a note out of your pocket and examine it, but you would be searching in vain for any intrinsic value. The value is not found in the ink, nor the material in which the ink is impregnated, nor in the wording. In fact, the wording provides the hint you'll need to begin to realize that there is nothing in and of itself that imputes any value into this piece of paper. Nothing, that is, but a construct of belief. Oh, and one other thing, brute force, but we'll get to that later. Our dollar's history begins with Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It states that Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and fix the standards of weights and measures. In 1792, the Coinage Act was passed, establishing a mint and regulating the coins of the United States. This law created and defined America's money. It called for a coin called the dollar, to contain about 3/4 of an ounce of silver. It also called for a half dollar, quarter, dime, and half dime, all made of silver. It called for a coin called an eagle, each worth $10 and containing a half an ounce of gold. It also called for a half eagle and a quarter eagle, all made of gold. Each coin, according to this act, would bear an impression of liberty, the word liberty, and the year of coinage. The reverse side shall have an impression of an eagle with the inscription United States of America. So the definition of money was a silver coin of the United States of the value of 1/10 of an eagle, or $1. An eagle was defined as a gold coin of the United States of the value of $10. For the first 80 years of our history, these coins were known as lawful money. In 1794, the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia began minting coins. This is what they looked like. They were strictly composed of either gold or silver, painstakingly fashioned to the proper weight. So strict was the standard on weights and measures, and so serious was the language of the U.S. Coinage Act, that Section 19 invoked the death penalty for anyone caught debasing the nation's money. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution states, "No state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender of payment of debts." Emit bills of credit equates to the issuance of unbacked paper promissory notes as money. America's entire economy was anchored to gold and silver by requiring the states to tender all payments in these coins. Some leaders today, however, claim that gold is not money.
Do you think gold is money? No.
This gold and silver standard stood as a protection for the people from the corrupt banksters who love to loan out money they don't have and profit from the interest. Such a debasing practice, known as fractional reserve banking, is outright counterfeiting and therefore theft. The gold system ensured that the nation's wealth was distributed to all the people rather than being centralized in the hands of a few. It constrained governments from issuing unbacked notes of debt, which is what the Federal Reserve note is today. In fact, many, including Benjamin Franklin, held that a dishonest money system was a main reason for the Revolutionary War. He wrote, "The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators was probably the prime cause of the Revolution." Two central banks materialized in early America in order to manipulate the nation's money supply. The first Bank of the United States was established in 1791. In spite of opposition from people like Thomas Jefferson, who argued against its constitutionality, the first bank's charter was revoked by James Madison. In 1816, the second bank of the U.S. was formed. Andrew Jackson, sworn enemy of the central bank, despised the thought of private bankers controlling America's money. Its charter was revoked in 1833. Gold's discovery in California in 1849 caused the mint to add a $1 tenth gold eagle and a $20 double gold eagle in order to distribute the gold across the population, honoring the founders' principle of decentralizing power by spreading the wealth. The presence and universal acceptance of gold shackled private bankers and severely limited inflation. It's interesting to note that in the 57 years from 1833 to 1890, gold, priced at $20.67 an ounce, fluctuated only 1 penny. And from 1891 to 1930, gold fluctuated just 74 cents from a low of $20.58 to a high of $21.32. In 1861, individual rights trampling President Abraham Lincoln financed the War of Northern Aggression by printing unbacked paper money, an act that debased America's money and, according to the Coinage Act of 1792, placed him under penalty of debt. During this criminal act, the Treasury reeled in coins and replaced them with Lincoln's greenback. These notes were denominated in both dollars and cents, and virtually all of America's money was converted to paper. In just 4 years, nearly 100% of the gains in the standard of living and the purchasing power of the dollar had been wiped out, along with over 600,000 lives. After the war, the mint resumed coining money. The dollar gained value, even going through periods of increased buying power. In 1866, contrary to the Constitution, they replaced the silver dime with a 5-cent nickel, allowing them to quickly replenish their silver reserves. Unfortunately, the U.S. government was still issuing paper dollars in the form of notes. Here, an 1878 $20 note reads, "This note is legal tender at its face value for all debts, public and private, except duties on imports and interest on the public debt." In other words, neither foreign nations nor the international bankers who finance them would accept this as money. Because it wasn't money. It was a note, a loan, an IOU. It was debt. The creators of this debt are saying, you can use it as money among yourselves, but don't try to pay us with it. All money created out of thin air is debt. They expect you to accept that debt as a fair trade for your labor, while they reject that debt for themselves. In the 1880s, the Treasury began issuing a new kind of paper money called silver and gold certificates. The legalese on these certificates reads, "This certifies that there has been deposited in the Treasury of the United States $1 silver dollar, payable to the bearer on demand." Each silver certificate represented one physical silver or gold coin in the Treasury. This bill says nothing about a note because it isn't an IOU. There is no restriction on imports or interest on the public debt. Foreign nations and international bankers would accept this as money because it was money. However, if the government decreed that they will no longer honor that certificate, you are left with nothing but a fancy-looking piece of paper. The early 1900s brought men like J.P. Morgan to the forefront. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property. Thus, a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Frederick Allen of Life magazine would later write, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic of 1907, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." The 1907 financial crisis that caused the New York Stock Exchange to lose 50% from the previous year prompted the people to beg the government to break the grip of the money trust. This paved the way for Morgan and his allies to step in with the solution to the problem they created. And on December 23, 1913, the Federal Reserve was born. The Federal Reserve, a cartel of international banking counterfeiters and money manipulators, began printing Federal Reserve notes, a government-sanctioned banknote. This note, like the greenbacks which preceded it, was a demand note. It was redeemable for gold, but only in Washington or at a member bank. If you lived far away, it was highly unlikely that you would redeem this paper for the precious metal. The note itself admits that it is not lawful money. Something that can be exchanged for lawful money is not lawful money itself. 19 years after the Fed's creation, FDR, another counterfeit-enabling president, also subject to the criminal penalty of death according to the Coinage Act of 1792, demonetized gold, ending the production of gold coins, certificates, and silver dollars in order to stimulate the economy. He allowed the Fed to print notes that were not redeemable for lawful money. 1 year later, in April of 1933, FDR issued Executive Order 6102, requiring all persons under the threat of $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison or both to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933, their gold coins, bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve in exchange for $20.67 in Federal Reserve paper. After the confiscation of gold and the criminalization of those holding it, gold was raised 60% to $35 an ounce, resulting in an immediate loss for those who had surrendered the precious metal. America's leaders had stolen the labor and true wealth of her citizens and replaced it with worthless paper. 11 years later, in 1944, while World War II continued to rage, 730 delegates from all 44 Allied nations gathered at Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to establish rules for commercial and financial relations among the world's industrial states. Because of the economic and physical devastation inflicted on virtually every country involved in the war, and because the U.S. emerged from that conflict as an economic and military powerhouse in possession of an estimated 50% of the world's known gold, the Bretton Woods Agreement replaced the British pound and established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. This meant that international commodities were priced in dollars. The agreement, which gave the US an incredible financial advantage, was made under the condition that those dollars would remain redeemable for gold at a consistent rate of $35 per ounce. But with the unrestricted, unregulated, 30-year-old Federal Reserve fox watching over the gold-filled henhouse, and its greedy fingers itching to print more notes, those nations would soon discover that entrusting your nation's wealth to a nation that had already ripped off its own citizens was a financially destructive act. 1945 brought an end to the war, revealing two of the planet's undisputed superpowers, the United States and Russia. This began 4 decades of sustained political and military tensions, including the ever-looming threat of mutual nuclear destruction. The Cold War had begun. America, after Bretton Woods, entered a time of great economic recovery and prosperity, such that in the 18 years between 1946 and 1964, Americans were busy adding 78 million baby-booming children to the population. However, as prosperous and financially beneficial as Bretton Woods was to Americans, it had a major flaw. There was nothing in the agreement to prevent the Fed from expanding the supply of Federal Reserve notes. Soon, there wouldn't be enough gold to back all the notes in circulation. 1964 brought the last year America's coins were struck with silver, finally physically detaching our nation's coinage from any link to precious metals. During the 1960s and early 70s, as the Vietnam War intensified, it became clear to the countries that had entrusted the U.S. with their gold that the Fed was running budget deficits and flooding the world with paper dollars. The French, under Charles de Gaulle, became suspicious that the U.S. would be unable to honor its Bretton Woods obligations to redeem their excess dollars in gold, and as the French exchanged surplus dollars for gold, the U.S. Treasury's gold stock declined alarmingly. Rather than use his presidential powers to eliminate the counterfeiting bankers, return the U.S. to a sound money system, and honor their Bretton Woods Agreement, Nixon chose a different course on August 15, 1971.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Defend the dollar against the speculators sounds similar to the 1907 break the grip of the money trust mantra that led to the creation and scourge of the Federal Reserve. Nixon's decree closed the gold window, unilaterally ending the Bretton Woods Agreement and robbing every nation that trusted us. As a seemingly unrelated side note, the details of which rest beyond the scope of this video, Nixon, 59 days prior to his announcement of global theft, officially initiated the war on drugs. This effectively gave rise to national crime, empowered drug cartels, and created a government monopoly and financial windfall through covert, governmentally controlled drug trafficking and sales. In 1973, Nixon struck a deal with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia to only accept US dollars as payment for oil and to invest any excess profits in US Treasury bonds, notes, and bills. Military protection of Saudi oil fields would, in return, be supplied by the U.S. By 1975, the same offer was extended to every member of OPEC, who also agreed to only sell their oil in U.S. dollars. This detachment of the U.S. dollar from gold and its connection to foreign oil forced every importing nation in the world to start maintaining a constant supply of Federal Reserve paper. In order to obtain that paper, they would have to sell real physical goods to America. Every nation needs a robust economy in order to survive. And since you can't get oil unless you purchase dollars, the powers that be who run the U.S. have ensured that there is a constant demand for those dollars. While the demand remains for dollars, the dollar will hold its value, even while the Fed continues to print and type them into existence. This is the origin of the petrodollar system. Worthless paper went out, everything America wanted came in, and the U.S. got very rich as a result. So the members of OPEC were kept in power by the U.S. while the exporter nations amassed great wealth and banked their dollars at the Federal Reserve in the United States. This is called the petrodollar cycle. After the petrodollar recycling system was implemented, 70% of Saudi Arabia's wealth landed in one account, the Federal Reserve of New York. So the U.S. kept the Saudis in power, they got rich, and America had an unlimited credit card. Here's how it works. Japan needs oil to keep their economy moving. They make a Honda and sell it to America for dollars. They take some of those dollars and give them to OPEC. OPEC gives Japan oil for dollars because they don't accept the yen or any other currency. OPEC then takes those dollars and gives them back to the United States at the Federal Reserve. So the Fed prints the currency and exchanges it for real goods from our trading partners. Those countries use it to pay their oil bill, and OPEC invests it back into the U.S. That is petrodollar recycling. As long as oil can only be purchased with dollars, we can print them for nothing. America has its very own money tree. In the 16 years between 1975 and 1991, the U.S. used their oil-backed currency to outspend all other nations in order to amass the most powerful weaponry and military in world history. The Soviet Union never had a chance. With the collapse of the communist bloc and the end of the Cold War in 1991, as well as America's emergence as the undisputed world superpower, many believed that a new era of peace and stability had begun. But the powers that be had other ideas. Within that same year, the U.S. invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War, crushing the Iraqi military, destroying its infrastructure, and imposing crippling sanctions which continued for the next decade throughout H.W. Bush and Clinton's administration, resulting in the deaths of more than 500,000 children. Clinton's administration was fully aware of these deaths.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
So the two pillars that underpin American supremacy are the dollar as the world reserve currency, which is backed by the second pillar, the awesome might of the United States military. If the dollar loses its status as the world's reserve currency, there will be no more funding for the empire we've built around the globe, and an unfunded military becomes an impotent military. If that supremacy relies on other nations holding dollars for oil, then any nation which challenges that arrangement becomes the target of American discipline through acts of war like sanctions or direct military engagement. In November of 2000, Saddam Hussein became the challenger of that arrangement by announcing that he would begin trading oil for euros. From 2001 to the beginning of the war, Iraq exported about 3.3 billion barrels of oil. The US bought 2.5 billion of those barrels but had to pay in euros. The petrodollar system was under threat. It was at this time that the Bush administration, with the help of mainstream media, fabricated the story of Iraq's possession of weapons of mass destruction. Iraq was quickly placed on the list of axis of evil nations.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Is it a mere coincidence that less than 10 months after a direct assault on the petrodollar arrangement that this happened? The horrible tragedy of that day was used as a catalyst to strip Americans of their freedoms, further expand the military budget, and invade Iraq. Once the US had control in Iraq, oil sales were immediately switched back to the dollar, costing the Iraqis 17% of their profits due to the euro's higher value. This pattern of petrodollar protection was replayed when, in Libya, Gaddafi was in the process of organizing a bloc of African countries to create a gold-based currency called the dinar, with the intent of replacing the dollar in that region. In 2011, US and NATO forces destabilized and toppled the Libyan government, executing Gaddafi in the process and immediately setting up the Libyan central bank. Those who control the US understand that even if a few countries begin to sell their oil in another currency, it will set up a chain reaction and the dollar will collapse. They understand that there is nothing else holding up the value of the dollar at this point, and so does the rest of the world. And it is the brute force of the United States military that is deployed to crush each and every resistant state in the Middle East and Africa. China and Russia have made it crystal clear that they will not tolerate an attack on Iran or Syria. If Iran, their key oil-producing ally, fails, they will be unable to escape the dollar without setting off a global conflict. And since it is America who has chosen to rob other nations with their petrodollar scheme, at whom do you think other nations will be angry for burdening them with so much forced debt? The dollars in your pocket represent the labor at which you worked in order to obtain them. But those dollars are dead, generated by a warmongering cabal of elite international banking criminals who have managed to pull off the greatest heist in human history. We are all in this together. We have been enslaved, and it's up to us to work on creating solutions to free ourselves from the taskmasters who have fashioned our chains.